Hello, Curry Coast. You are listening to the Daily Weekly, and I am your host, Dakotah Daily. I am super excited to be offering this show live today from our studio here in Brookings, Oregon. And I want to start off at the top of the hour by saying that we are broadcasting from the unceded and traditional territories of the Chetco and the Tututni Native American people. I myself am endlessly grateful for the ongoing cultural and ecological stewardship of the Northwest American Indian Coalition, which is our local-led, Indigenous-led nonprofit that is doing ongoing land management and cultural stewardship in the area. Additionally, I would like to thank the show's sponsor, Rick McNamer. And I would also like to let everybody know who's listening that for just $5, you can buy the host of this show a beer either before, during, or after the recording. And I would like to thank our video producer, Michael, for sponsoring today's show in terms of fermentation. And without further ado, I would like to announce that today's show is a very exciting one in that we have a guest. Instead of just listening to me yap and all of my favorite songs, we're going to mix it up a little bit and we're going to have another voice. And I'm hoping that everything is set up with Amanda to come in and introduce herself. She is calling today from Canada, and I reckon she'll be able to tell you a little bit more about that if she is online. Can you hear us, Amanda?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. You are on the air on KCIW.
This is awesome and it's an honor. It's been a long time.
So where are you calling from today, Amanda?
Well, I am currently calling from the University of Manitoba here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. One of the coldest places in Canada for sure, but spring's just around the corner.
Yeah, I was gonna ask how's the weather at this time of year?
How's the weather? It's kind of it's gross, honestly. The geese are moving in. They're everywhere. Scary, terrifying, entering any building. They are like bodyguards. But
I
they're
can picture that. Yeah.
seriously though, there's like beware of geese on every single door and every single facility because you have to actually caution people. I think it's a legality, but anyways, where the grass is slowly getting green. It's pretty. I see runoff and snow melt runoff everywhere in all of the fields and the ditches. So it's I
Can
like
I
spring. I like
clarify?
spring. It's my least favorite season.
Y'all are concerned that the geese are gonna get into the buildings, is that right?
I think it's more of a concern of attacking customers.
Uh-huh.
There's been
Biting
very
fingers, this sorts of
kids'
things.
fingers breaking students' arms. It happened last year. A goose broke a student's arm. So they just send out an email. They put precautions up
Yeah.
outside. They're tough animals.
Where I used to live in British Columbia, for a couple of weeks in a row, we had a couple consecutive owl attacks. And it was like all students that had pretty like frizzy kind of curly hair. And there was some nesting instinct or predatory instinct that was activated by this spotted owl behind our residential building. And there was warnings going out for people to watch their mats from getting attacked.
Curly haired.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was pretty
Just
funny.
a precaution for all kids with afros, don't go outside without a hat.
That's pretty much how the email read. So, Amanda, I know a little bit about why you are where you are and what you're doing right now, but not very much. And our listeners don't know anything at all. So I was curious if you wanted to give us an elevator pitch about what you're doing right now. What brought you to Manitoba?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm born and raised in Winnipeg. My family lives in a small town outside of Winnipeg, so I'm home. Got a big family here. It's nice to be home. Uh, and I went to school on the East Coast, so I played hockey. And then I was traveling around, which is when I met you in one of those years on Kauai. And I came back to pursue soil science. The University of Manitoba has the best program in the country for soil sciences, and I have an opportunity, a big scholarship, to pursue some research in the organic, soon to be hopefully regenerative organic space here at the university as a master's student. So yeah, I'm a big dirt nerd.
I can confirm that is true. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
yes.
how far into the program are you right now, and what are your thoughts about it? Because the last time we actually hung out, you had gotten into the program and you were really excited, but you hadn't started it yet.
Yeah, super excited. So for those listening, Dakotah and I met on a tiny little island, magical place in our heart. We continue to revisit this place called Kauai, and it's the Garden Island of Hawaii. So I was there living on a farm in a tent, and Dakotah, we can tell that story later, but I was also studying the soil there. Different soil than we have here in the prairies, as it is dormant for 6 months out of the year. But I am about 1 year, no, not quite 1 year. I am acting as though I'm 1 year into my program, but I'm about 7 months into my program and learning so much. I've already completed all of my research, per se. I have one ongoing experiment right now where I'm studying the effects of all of the different composts that I made in my first experiment. And so I do actually get to interact with plants, which is awesome. A little bit about my experiment. I'm studying recycled phosphorus forms and their availability when they are co-composted. So we're trying to close some nutrient loops within agriculture because we, as I was mentioning earlier with this snow melt, usually when you see flooded fields or you see runoff or full ditches, you're not concerned too much about the nutrients. You just see water. But whenever I see that, I think of leftover residue from applied fertilizers and other organic forms as well, not just synthetic fertilizers, but that phosphorus, that nitrogen, more so phosphorus, ends up transporting off of the field. So we're trying to find ways in which we can sustainably collect that, get it back onto the field, and have it stay there. So I'm working with some organic amendments and we're co-composting. So I like to say that my master's project is very stinky. It's quite stinky when working with compost. Yeah.
Would you explain to me what co-composting is? I hadn't heard that term before.
Yeah, yeah. So basically I have these giant biodigesters and they turn any material that's organic, and organic meaning it contains carbon, into soil or compost, fertilizer within 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours. So compost usually takes about a year to 2 years naturally on its own, but it's an aerobic process. So we can add in materials. So if we add in something into these composting machines, that material essentially is getting co-composted with other organic materials. So I'm adding in recycled phosphorus sources that we've collected from water treatment plants in with the compost and determining which mixture is the best
Hmm.
right now.
So, what are the kinds of things that you're considering and you're researching adding to finish this process?
Unfortunately, my my scholarship is funded by Big Egg, so we are studying. We are
Quickly, we ran into the legally ambiguous area. Our listeners could sign NDAs if that would help.
yes. So gosh. Well, so I'm in the system, Coda. We know this. I'm in the system to break out of the system.
Yep.
I'm getting another piece of paper to tell me all of the things that are required for me to say that I know all of the things. So I'm working in the system for the system.
And there's a
And
concern that you are about to discover a genius recipe, and the people who are sponsoring your research are copywriting your research and own your research.
they own all of it. They own all of my research. Yeah. So anything that I find, I am
Well, we can just end the show
responsible.
right there. I mean, that was really, I was just trying to figure out how to make the Krusty Krab burger, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's
No,
locked up.
the secret recipe. Oh my gosh, the secret ingredient. Yeah, but I am funded by a big company that wants to utilize their product, which is being recycled and removed from wastewater. So we have an abundance of this product, and it is super beneficial, has been used in agriculture before, just not in organic agriculture. The product and the molecule is called struvite. So it's a naturally occurring bound form of phosphorus that's it occurs in the piping systems of water treatment plants, ultimately because when phosphorus interacts with a certain when it's put in a certain environment with other chemicals and other elements, that it does naturally form this crystalline structure. And so in removing it, they had an excess amount of it, and they were like, what are we going to do with all the phosphorus? Like, not they question obviously why the phosphorus was in the water treatment plants, but basically they have an excess of it, and we found a way to find a safe way to put it back into the soils from which it was getting lost from, and in the runoff that I was mentioning earlier. So I'm working with struvite. That's one of the compounds that we are adding in to co-compost. And then I'm also working with a few other ones just to compare. But my research is funded primarily because of the potential for struvite to be used in organic agriculture.
Got it. And it sounds like struvite is something that there is way more of than what we know what to do with. Is that right?
Not way more, not necessarily. I'll word it in a way that's we have a lot of it because
It comes from
it's
poopy water.
it goes through poopy water. Yeah,
And I
it
would
goes through
think
poopy
we would
water.
have unlimited poopy water
We
virtually
do.
relative to our
A lot of
need
people
for it.
don't. A lot of people don't question, where their poop goes when they flush it. It's kind of out of
Yep.
sight, out of mind,
Yep.
right? But I myself personally am quite curious about where everything goes. I'm always asking,
Well, you
where
have
do things come from? Where do
a
they go?
passionate obsession about tiny crawling things, I've noticed.
Oh yeah.
And poopy water is a really interesting place if you are on the scale of tiny, tiny crawling things. Well, I'm wondering for other people who are as ignorant about soil science as I am, I'm wondering that was a great conceptual understanding and context of why your research matters in the current state of affairs in your field that contextualize your research. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about like what do you do with your hands? Are you scooping up dirt and putting it under microscopes? Are you letting things grow? Are you hitting it with lasers? Are you taking pictures of it? What is your
We do so many things here at the U of M. Yeah, so I can hit it with lasers. I can hit it with different sorts of wavelengths of light in order to determine what is in it.
and why is that interesting? Why would you use different kinds of light?
I think to back up a little bit more and just talk about why soil is interesting for those curious enough to ask is, do you eat food, Coda?
I eat food every day. I am
You eat
obsessed.
food every day.
Yeah, I'm a
Okay.
hardcore. A lot of people know this who listen to my show. I am a hardcore supporter of food.
Food.
Yeah.
Love
It's a hot take, but I'm going to put my stick in the ground.
So we do all eat food. I think that all of the listeners can definitely relate to just the enjoyment of nutrients going into the body in order to fuel this vessel, which is my human form, right? So all things that we consume came from the ground, came from the earth. Ultimately, if you eat beef, that cow was grazing in a field somewhere. So what I like to ask is soil is extremely important because not only am I the health of the things that I put into my body, but I am the health of what those things grew in. So the cow can only be as healthy as the grass it's eating, and the grass can only be as healthy as the soil that it's grown in. So backing all the way up in the chain of events, it all comes down to soil and the health of the soil. So it's a very important um, ecosystem and universe that I'm studying, all the tiny things under my microscope. But the microscopy actually is just a side hobby. It's not even my master's. I decided to add a whole entire other chapter into my master's just because I'm obsessed. But yeah, it's quite a crazy, crazy world down there when you take a look at what goes down, because everything that goes up must go down.
Yeah.
I think that's the saying. What's the saying? Everything that comes up must no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's one saying for sure.
Yeah, it's
And I
infinite.
have a question I want to ask about soil science, kind of just generally. But before I do that, I do want to say also that our phone number for texting in is live. So if you're listening to this either here in Brookings or online at kciw.org, you can text us at 541-661-4098 and ask questions or make comments to anything Amanda or we are talking about. That number is 541-661-4098. And we would love to hear your thoughts. So please do not be shy, listeners. And the question I have for you, Amanda, is, so I spent almost a decade as a raft guide, sitting on the back of the boat and just yapping to people, in addition to making sure they were having fun and staying alive. And when I was on the boat, I would tell people all the time about how important the salmon returning all the way to Idaho, which is 7,000 vertical feet they have to swim from the Pacific Ocean, and 700 miles up the Columbia River system into the Snake, into the Salmon River. One of the things that I would talk to people about was how important the body of the salmon was, because they would be eaten by, or partially eaten by, the first predator to take a bite. And then you imagine like a bald eagle scoops a salmon out of the river, takes a big bite out of it. They've already stopped eating when they're swimming back. So they start to decay, and they're dedicating all of their energy to returning to the exact same rock that they were born on however many years ago. They're swimming all the way from the Pacific Ocean to the high mountains of Idaho to go lay these eggs. And then as soon as they spawn, they die. So they're already kind of decomposing. A bald eagle picks one up, takes a big bite out of it, and there's so many salmon coming back historically that it just drops it, and then a bear comes and eats half of it and drops it, and it goes down the food chain. And eventually they decompose and they deposit. This is the story that I would tell people, which I think has a lot of truth, but I don't understand much about the actual soil science. But what we would say is the Salmon River is like a giant conveyor belt of phosphorus and nitrogen to the soil. And out here, the high Doug fir and the yellow pine ponderosas, you could actually see historical levels, like when there was a massive salmon run, because the trees are way bigger. The growth on one ring from one year is exponentially bigger when you have a massive salmon run, because it's just fertilizer for the entire forest coming from a marine ecosystem that otherwise doesn't have as much access to this. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, just like conceptually, about phosphorus and nitrogen, because I have zero background in chemistry at all. Like, do either of those things or any other major things that you're looking for in terms of like base elements for soil health, do they have like particular characteristics? Like when people talk about like a nitrogen fixing plant, how is that different than like capturing phosphorus again, which I think is what you mentioned your research was on? If I don't really know much about like soil chemistry, and I'm wondering if there's any things as like a science communication piece at kind of that like higher level about phosphorus or nitrogen or other. I know there's a third thing that they put on fertilizer bags. Is it phosphorus, nitrogen, and
You're talking the NPK.
yes.
So it's potassium.
Yes. Could you tell us a little bit about these things?
Yeah, absolutely. So NPK is the essential, think of it as like you think of essential amino acids for a human. We have 8, sometimes 9, depending on who you're talking to build our muscle and to fuel the enzymes that we create in our body. And plants, they need sunlight, they need water, and they need a bunch of micronutrients, but the macronutrients are considered to be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Oftentimes it comes in different waves. Like, for example, phosphorus is extremely important for early plant growth. It is also very important for fruit development. Nitrogen is also extremely important for early plant growth, but too much nitrogen can cause the burning of the seedlings. So when we're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen also helps make the the green chlorophyll that you see on the leaves of the plants that assists it in photosynthesis, helps them build proteins. Obviously, nitrogen is a component in all amino acids. So ultimately, when you think of the salmon and you think of returning back to the ecosystem, that's the fate of absolutely everything. Everything comes from and will return to the soil. You yourself, me, myself, everyone listening, we're all made up of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, boron, like chlorine, all of the things just reinvented, reiterated, kind of like scrambled up and put up in different areas. So ultimately we will get broken down into these core components in order for them to be reused again, because matter cannot be created or destroyed. So here we go, using my like old high school science, pulling that up there. I think that's like Newton's second law or something. But when we're talking about phosphorus, which is my specialty, phosphorus has a very interesting life cycle because it cannot be um, it cannot be lost to the air, whereas nitrogen is very complex. It has multiple pathways in which it can be introduced into the soil and lost to the air and lost via leaching from the soil, whereas phosphorus actually needs water in order for it to move. And plants also need to be able to uptake that phosphorus. And there's so many different forms. So there's so many different forms of nitrogen, so many different forms of phosphorus, potassium as well, but less so, more so with phosphorus and nitrogen. And the plant can only absorb a small, tiny fraction of the forms that are actually present in the soil. And the responsibility of the microbial communities in the soil, as well as the fungal communities, the archaea, what they do is they play a role to break down the nutrients, just as the bear and the eagle eat pieces of the salmon. That breaks the salmon down into smaller components that then become smaller building blocks within the bear as the bear's microbes in its stomach break it down. And then ultimately, we love to talk about poop, apparently, poopy water, poopy bear. That bear disperses those nutrients around the forest floor. So think of it as like the chain gets built up to create what is possible, which was the salmon, and gets broken back down to become what is possible to become the tree, the bear, the ecosystem. It's feeding those nutrients back into it. Ultimately, the salmon is just a transporter. Ultimately, kind of all are just transporters and walking bunches of nutrients that will one day return to the soil and become something new. This and which is kind of beautiful when you think about it as well. But yeah, I can go into more detail as well in regards to phosphorus and nitrogen and potassium, but those are the building blocks for fertilizers as well in agriculture speaking. But yeah, I'm definitely Mrs. Phosphorus around here. That's my research is primarily on phosphorus.
Well, I love the way that you scaled that metaphor of the microbes to phosphorus are like the bear to the salmon of you have this biological agent, whether it's really big or really small, you have this organism that's taking the Legos apart, right? Before the Legos get stacked up to whatever the new creation
Exactly.
is.
And even breaking it down even into the plastic that becomes the Lego, right? That's the microbial job. If without the microbes present, the building blocks would not be able to be reused in a way that's phosphorus, for example, in the soil needs to be made into an available form in order for the plant to be able to take it up. So there's a lot of chemistry that goes on in the soil. A lot of it is actually conducted by plants. Plants are absolutely phenomenal. They're the conductors of all of it, secreting and excreting different sorts of sugars in order to attract microbial species, different kinds of carbohydrates to attract different specific kinds of bacteria and fungus. They create relationships with these fungus underneath the soil and recruit the fungus in exchange. They work as like a currency. They'll exchange their sugars for other nutrients, like mycorrhizal fungi, for example, the tiny little root-like hair structures that you see if you pull up a plant and you see a little bit of white fluff, it almost looks like. That is mycorrhizal fungi. And what they are doing is they're actually acting as extensions from the plant to recruit and find phosphorus for the plant. So the plant is playing the conductor role. It's like, hey, if you work for me, you bring me a little bit of phosphorus, I'll give you a little bit of my sugar. And it does that with bacteria as well.
Cool.
So plants ultimately are quite intelligent things, although they cannot speak. They speak without words.
No kidding. Well, I just got a text message and I love the way it opens up. It says perfect subject for Earth Day, which I forgot that today is the day, but you're absolutely right. So thank you, texter. Perfect subject for Earth Day, Earth. If soil, or soil if you prefer. I'm pretty sure Roundup is horrible as a weed killer because of the soil damage. Is vinegar, Dawn, or dish soap a better alternative? If not, what would Amanda suggest?
Amanda would suggest, well, it depends on, I guess, what you're trying to get rid of. Because Roundup is usually used for weeds and weed suppression and the killing of what we call it glyphosate around here. We're all very familiar with, well, maybe we're not familiar with glyphosate, but it is a very widespread chemical that is Roundup Ready plants are the ones that you see that are marketed, have been marketed since the agricultural boom, one would say. But for Roundup, it is a weed suppressant. So I would think more so in rather than how can I eliminate something, what more can I add is the question that I was taught in Kauai would be, instead of trying to be rid of a pest or be rid of something that I no longer want in my garden, how can I either utilize that thing and add it into my ecosystem, or what can I introduce that is a predator or a competing component to that entity that I'm trying to get rid of. So for weeds, if you're thinking Roundup, I would try to find a way to mulch the ground, meaning to get the ground cover that's it's not exposed to sunlight as much. So any weed seeds or any possible weeds that are on the ground are then not reaching the sunlight, but the plant itself is. I would plant cover crops or creeping, crawling, like you can use thyme, you can use different sorts of pumpkins or cucumbers. I like to have my cucumbers vertical. But if this is in regards to gardening, there's definitely a lot of different approaches that one would take. Vinegar isn't going to kill a weed, unfortunately. Very good cleaning agent for inside. I use a diluted form for cleaning all surfaces. It's a very good antibacterial. I use it for cleaning mostly everything because it's not harmful to humans. It's a very safe acid to use. But depends on that question if it's specific for a garden.
I I love that change in philosophy and looking at the entire thing. It's something I think about a lot, working in land management myself, in particular and related to invasive species, because a lot of the money that goes into invasive species management is about removal and eradication. And we're facing, you and I, in a sense, work on almost opposite ends of the spectrum of scale when it comes to land management, because you are working at almost the smallest scale physically possible in terms of like the level of detail that you're noticing. And I look at thousands of miles of mountains and ridges and rivers and lakes, and I'm looking at really like landscape level species management. So one thing that I think is really interesting is the conversation of invasive species. And when I'm looking at it at a landscape level scale and I'm seeing money go towards projects of removing invasive species, when I'm playing these things out in my mind, will sometimes kind of wonder, okay, well, what happened if humanity got the earth to a place where it couldn't sustain human life anymore and we kind of stopped showing up, like maybe even beyond we stopped putting grant dollars towards invasive species managed, but like what if there was an extinction event on Earth and these species just ran from where they are right now? I spend a lot of time wondering, what does that landscape look like? And what are the niches in this ecosystem and the relationships in this ecosystem that would eventually reestablish a moving and a dynamic harmony? Because all ecosystems are in a state of flux. And invasive species, even if we look at something, and there's plenty of really good examples, invasive species and as well disease and infestation. Like we're currently here on the Oregon coast experiencing Fur-mageddon, where Doug fir is just changing climatic conditions. Just heat and moisture are changing in a way that we are seeing landscape level changes of entire regions having devastated fir populations, which are essentially a cash crop in the West of logging, just dying faster than we know how to process them. We're also experiencing sudden oak death. Oak are one of the most important species of trees to be working with and protecting. And a lot of our best oak is vulnerable to this like black plague called sudden oak death that's been running rampant the last couple of years. And to me, it's pretty clear that like sudden oak death, when I'm sitting around a table that has Forest Service people, BLM people, private people from across the South Coast in Northern California and deeper into Oregon, honestly, we're getting to the point where we sit around the table and people are like, oh yeah, we're seeing sudden oak death. They call it SOD, SOD, sudden oak death. They say, yeah, we've got sod over there, we've got sod over there. And you look at the map of where this super highly contagious disease is breaking out, and you look at how widespread invasive species are, and you look at how much work it is to actually take invasive species out. I think it's really interesting to say, okay, instead of this process of removal or of killing, what are the ecosystem relationships that we can work with that run on their own and are moving towards a different kind of harmony, even if that challenges what our idea of a baseline is? Because it's really evident that baseline ecosystem conditions are changing both on a macro and a micro scale. And I think looking at your garden and being like, how can I change the conditions of this to grow something else? Because oftentimes I know weeds come back in disturbed areas. And I've heard that just in my brief career that I had as a gardener for a couple of weary years where I was wandering around, I remember people saying, these weeds are growing back in disturbed soil types because they're the only plant that can work in this ecosystem, which is so depleted, and they're also fixing the soil. The weeds are the first ones on the front line responding to this like graveyard of barren soil, and they're paving the way for other plants to enrich the soil later on. So if we're going and spraying them with Roundup, it's a totally different approach than what you were saying of like a more generative kind of will run on its own momentum kind of species management, which I think is really cool to hear at that scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what Roundup does is Roundup is it is like the trademark or the punchline to it is like Roundup Ready because it is non-selective, meaning it kills whatever it touches. So it's a very dangerous chemical that we can find in our drinking water and in our rain now throughout North America. And it doesn't break down at all from my
Wow.
research. I do
Ever?
need to look into it a little bit more. It is kind of like a heavy metal. I do think that there are ways in which we can remove it from a system, but it has just been used at such a large scale that it takes hundreds of years to break down. And since it is sprayed, twice a year, sometimes three times a year on certain crops, depending on your cropping system and
Yeah,
how
I
much
mean,
land you have.
I can attest to
Mhm.
that. I am right now, well, not right now because I'm in a recording studio, but yesterday and tomorrow, what I'm working on is a watershed monitoring project through, this is funded by the Northwest American Indian Coalition. Big shout out to them. They're funding a research project, which I'm the lead on, where we are looking at watersheds and ecosystem level health for springs and fresh water sources. And I'm going around and I'm collecting water samples to test for glyphosate, which is the
Oh
primary
yeah.
chemical. And it's because in the forest here, we have a forestry practice of spraying glyphosate from planes and helicopters. That's the level and the scale at which these pesticides are being used for ecosystem management. And hearing you say that these are essentially acting like heavy metals that don't break up over hundreds of years, I think it really just puts that into context, really, when you think about drinking water sources and clean water sources, what the impact of glyphosate or Roundup would be.
Yeah. So it like in a system where there's more diversity, which we talked about earlier in regards to adding more, which I'm very happy that you resonated with ultimately, because we're trying to go back and fix a problem that we caused by intervening even more than we already have. And nature does not favor monocropping, monoculture, selecting for one thing. She favors diversity. And I say she and nature as a separate entity. I found out through my reading um, of some Indigenous wisdom that nature actually does not exist in the Indigenous language and in other languages as well, because it solidifies a separateness from humans and nature. So there is actually no separateness, which I found absolutely beautiful. But for in regards to adding diversity, right? Like glyphosate can break down. It has the potential to break down. It's not a forever chemical, but it does depend on the health of your soil and the microbial activity, the moisture, the pH, like how much diversity you have within that garden. You think about an old growth forest, it's some of the healthiest, most abundant, profound, amazing things to look at under the microscope in regards to soil activity because of the diversity, because of the amount of different leaves that are falling, that are degrading on the ground, because of, like we talked about with you said with your land management, is letting those larger species and smaller species roam free. Like that is one of the reasons why there's such degradation and such like negative impacts with these climates and these large scale changes, is we're not letting herds walk through environments anymore, and plants have evolved with animals, just as though plants have evolved with fungi, and we're changing things at such an exponential scale that we're not letting it catch up. We're not letting evolution catch up. Evolution happens non-exponentially, right? It's very slow.
I love that you brought up the this idea about a separation between nature and culture, or natural and human society. This is something that I love to talk about on my show. And I was thinking about it recently because, as you attested to, like oftentimes in traditional ecological knowledge and native wisdom and a lot of different cultures that we see in a lot of different places, not to homogenize Indigenous culture, but this is certainly a pattern that I've noticed, at least across the West, that there isn't as strong of a distinction between nature and culture as we generally like imported with Western colonization and expansion here into this part of Oregon, is this idea that nature and culture are two separate things. Human society is different than the forest, and there are different laws that govern them. And the difference being that in traditional ecological knowledge, oftentimes there's this story of connection and relationality. And what that lends to is that, like, our Western perspective on conservation is that in order to conserve and protect and steward a land, you should wall it off and nobody should ever go in there so that it cannot be corrupted and degraded by the menacing hands of mankind and society. We got to protect that up. That's our kind of like fence and border conservation. And I was thinking about this recently with the idea of like, well, imagine if like nature, Mother Earth, like imagine if that was your grandma. And the alternative vision that we see oftentimes in traditional ecological knowledge is like, actually, it's about like relationship and like taking care and being like really involved. Like it's about being like face to face with what's going on. And I think that for me, it's like a helpful tool to explain it in thinking about like if Mother Nature was like your grandma, it becomes really clear that there's a difference that like if your grandma is sick, are you gonna just leave your grandma alone? Is your idea of how to take care of your grandma to not look at her, to not talk to her, to make sure that nobody ever goes to her house, to make sure that she's completely isolated and there's no interaction? Or when your grandma is sick, is your idea to go ask her what she needs and to check in on her and to maybe, be staying on the couch over at her place until she gets better? Like, this idea that we leave things alone in nature in order to protect them is a uniquely Western one. And I think it's really worth bringing in because oftentimes the answers to these questions of like, should we be using Roundup? Should we be cutting trees down in the forest? If you tried to ask me, should we be cutting trees down in the forest? It's such a tough conversation because it's not a yes or no answer, right? Like, we should not be clear cutting, but we need to be doing fuels reduction work. And we can be taking out a lot of trees in areas that are high risk. And we can be making money off of timber and off of logging companies. And this is all the work I'm doing right now. We can make this a profitable thing by removing trees in a way that make the wildfire risk less severe. And in the same way, you can manage invasive species in your garden if you're willing to add some complexity and really consider like your relationship to the natural systems that you're working with, and just spend some time really getting to understand the web of relationships that they exist in between each other as living organisms in your garden or in the forest.
Yeah, I love how you said living organism there because that's a metaphor. Like you talked about the grandma, right? And it is beautiful to think of all of it, but also to include ourselves within the system as as the living organism that you are. You are an entire universe in respect to the bacteria and the cells, or even like you're an entire universe to your cells, which are then an entire universe for the small, tiny little, like even smaller than microscopic interactions and connections that happen at the neurotransmitter level, right? So when you think of when you go, like we said, what goes down, what goes up must also go down. Well, you can go back up again and think of Earth as the living organism, right? Where the trees being her lungs and the mountains are her stability, her bones. The water is her bloodstream, her circulatory system. You've got that, and something that I've kind of played with is like, what am I as a human? You know, like am I an endocrine system? Am I just transporting different sorts of communications and trying to communicate these multiple organs going around? Like, but the trees don't need me to communicate with the ground, right? They don't need us. So I feel like humans are almost the mind where we think we're separate from the body and we have the egoic sense of needing to protect or needing to take care of, when it's actually not just by letting it be, by becoming one with her. It would make sense that what you take from the ground you should also put back into it, right, rather than just taking from the ground. So it's very interesting to think of, as humans we have the ability to choose how we want to create that relationship and to heal our own individual relationship with nature so that we can reconnect. And something beautiful I've found on my travels was I met a Reiki master, and she's amazing. Her name is Julie and she lives in Portugal. Shout out Julie if you're listening. But
She probably, yeah, I bet she's probably listening.
yeah, she's probably listening. Um, but she has a beautiful vision and she has a beautiful calling. And one of her things was, in order to heal the planet, you have to heal the human, because the human cannot imagine a broken human trying to heal a broken planet, right? I don't believe that anything is broken. I believe that it's just a sense of remembering and reconnecting. Um, but how, like when you're sick, do you know how hard it is to get things done when you're sick? When you can't breathe and you can't sleep through the night and you have to sleep sitting up because you're so congested and you're coughing in class and you can't sit and concentrate because you're like, oh my gosh, I need some water, or these people are going to think I'm spraying them with COVID. Like, oh my gosh, I had a moment like that this year in my stats class. I was like, guys, I'm fine. I just swallowed water in an inappropriate way. It went down the wrong pipe. Why is everybody scared of me? Um, but how are you supposed to focus and function and operate at your best if and to heal something else, to look after something else when you're not feeling your best? And the earth is going to continue to provide for us and look after us. But she's imagine how proficient and how immaculate. And it is a shift that's happening. What I do like to focus on is the positive. As much as we can say everything's dying and climate change is happening in these microclimates, but there's a shift going on. There's a shift going on, and it's being realized. And a lot of individuals are making big movements towards that reconnection. They're realizing how good they feel when they eat certain things and how not great they feel when they eat others. They realize how much better they feel and find themselves seeking more time in nature rather than, I think our generation, and there was like a bit of miscommunication between generations and some knowledge that um maybe wasn't quite followed through with or passed down because there was a lot of things going on in the previous generations. There always is something going on. There's a big event, a big historical transition period. Um, but honestly, all of the things that I'm exposing myself to and choosing to focus on, because we ultimately do become our thoughts, are the positives that are happening in the world right now. Like generating more topsoil is such a profound and amazing accomplishment. And in the US and in Canada, there are huge projects for shifting large amounts of agricultural land to organic and then eventually into a regenerative, which is when you're adding more than you're taking away. It's to regenerate the land that it was before. Like the rewilding almost. I would love to rewild all of the agricultural fields. That would be amazing. But um yeah, so just there is shifts going on, and that's what I do want to also make very, very present in the way that I speak. Is it's there's hope. There's so much hope and so much potential for just the rewilding, like you talked about, is opening up those spaces rather than fencing them off. And I know that you also, I'm very curious about your work with the controlled burns and how that's tying in with, ecosystem systems and how that actually is a naturally occurring thing, but now it is regulated, which is awesome that we can still do that. But then also you have to fight for it, right?
Yeah, totally. One of the to follow up too on something that we were talking about earlier with just kind of this parallels between more Western perspectives and incorporating traditional ecological knowledge. And that's something that I pay attention to a lot because my background is in agency science. I used to do federal wildfire suppression, and now I am fortunate enough to be able to support Indigenous and rural wildfire reduction efforts or wildfire risk reduction efforts. I would say efforts at reducing wildfire severity because, spoiler alert, if you haven't listened to any of my other episodes, one of the things we got to do to make wildfires less bad, and by bad I mean destructive to ecosystems and human resources, is we actually got to light more things on fire. So in order to kind of reduce scary fire, we're bringing in good fire. But an idea that I'm kind of operating in worlds that could be seen as separate, with the science on one hand that comes from more Western technologies and ways of thinking, and then also trying to balance Indigenous wisdom. And there's a concept that is really important to me called two-eyed seeing. And it's kind of this idea of walking a path that is respecting both sides of the coin. And it's interesting when you really get down to it, like at least in my field, what the wildfire scientists, and oftentimes even more and more now, what the people who are in charge of and are doing wildfire suppression are saying is really similar to the cultural burn practitioners. And 3 weeks ago, I was at the Ignite prescribed burn training in Selma, and we had the good fortune of just being able to burn a couple dozen acres or so. And we started off with a cultural burn practitioner, and then we broke up into smaller groups, and we're working with people who do wildfire suppression for a living, wildfire fighters. And it was amazing. Other than the things that people were wearing and the words that people were using, people were talking about exactly the same thing, essentially, between the cultural burn practitioners who were using sap as drip torches off of the ends of sticks versus folks who were doing it, with a diesel gasoline mixture out of a metal can. We were all there pretty much understanding and talking about the same dynamics. And one of the things that comes up with this idea of two-eyed seeing is that the Western conversation, the military industrial complex, the like standard scientific communication and dialogue of what's happening with the forests and with wildfires in the Western United States and Canada is that we are in a wildfire crisis, and the language is all about catastrophizing. It's that we're at the brink of something major. It's that there's so much potential for high severity wildfire. It's that we're 150 years behind being able to catch up with this thing, and it feels like the doomsday clock is running out, even though the global doomsday clock did actually recently move 20 seconds to midnight. But this is the way that the conversation is framed, is big, scary. And there's a really interesting paper that I read that talks about, well, if you're looking at two-eyed seeing, what is the other eye seeing? If the Western eye and our two-eyed seeing is seeing this catastrophizing doomsday scenario, then the other eye that's coming from more of a place of indigenous wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge talks about the crossroads that we're at. And talking about it as a crossroads, I think, does a couple really important things differently than talking about it like a impending catastrophe. And when you talk about it like a crossroads, you are talking about opportunity, you're talking about choice, you're talking about possibility. And really what you're talking about is human agency and the creative will and spirit and belief in us as individuals and as communities and natural ecosystems to build resiliency. And there's still a focus on action, and there's still a focus with organizing. And maybe it can even come with a little bit less of the debilitating mindset that oftentimes comes with like climate change anxiety. So that's something I try to keep in mind because it can be kind of scary otherwise.
And yeah, and those things are like when you think of the origination of those thought processes, and ultimately like everything comes from either love or fear. And fear was created in order for us to be able to experience the full potential of love and in the world of duality and polarity. But um without getting too deep into that, you can tie back, or you can follow the cord, follow the root back to the seed of each thought and each given statement, whether it's media, whether it's conversations, whether it's just something that you said about yourself, right? And you go, okay, I can't do that, comes from fear, right? That's a statement that comes from fear of the unknown, fear of failure, and the fear of uncontrolled burns, right? That comes the thought of doomsday, that's originated in fears. But if you were to focus on the benefits, if we were to concentrate on the benefits of the controlled burns, which you've mentioned as well, or even just thinking back to, like you mentioned, the two-eyed seeing, that's something I'm also trying to build within my master's. It's hard to write about these kinds of things because from the one eye, right, you have the Indigenous wisdom, which is responsibility rather than ownership. It's like ceremony and kinships, whereas like Western science is very analytical and there's interventions and it's data driven, and while all of those things are needed in order to come up with strategic plans and to measure outcomes, we do still need to, stop, take our shoes off, and stand in the dirt. Get your hands in the dirt. And we mentioned earlier, you're asking what I use. I'm hands in the dirt. Maybe not necessarily the soil or the fresh compost, because there is still, the compost needs to go through a natural process in order to become safe to handle. But yeah, we gotta there's so much beauty in braiding those concepts together with the two eyes. And I just love that you brought that up for us to share that with your listeners today.
I also want to share for everybody because Amanda, I think you already know this, but I am really, really fortunate to be able to support some really, really cool work that's happening. I was able to come to this community at a really good time 2 years ago on the Smith River complex. And I, since then, have been living and working out here a little bit on and off at times, but we are supporting some really, really meaningful land management activities. And we're doing a lot of planning right now, but there is actually a lot of momentum in terms of being able to do good land stewardship. There's some really interesting things that are happening right now because of all of the changing politics around essentially like easier access for private logging on federal lands, which is actually maybe opening up some opportunities for doing strategic fuels reduction work in federal forest, which benefits local community members who are facing less wildfire risk and protecting their homes. It benefits private timber who's able to better protect their stands and the way that they are bringing money into the community. And it's reducing wildfire risk across the board. So people are interested in it. There's a lot of support. I get to work for these two really, really amazing women, Katrina, who runs the Northwest American Indian Coalition, and Tabitha Rude, who big shout out is listening to right now, and is single-handedly doing more to bring people together around the table and have hard conversations, and is so directly related to and responsible for so many powerful things that are happening, hopefully over the next couple of years, which are going to make substantial differences to people living in this community, kind of across the board in terms of ecosystem health and safety. And Amanda has been a massive contribution to this effort in a really indirect and funny way. So Amanda spent some time living in Kauai at a farm, living in a tent, like she mentioned earlier. And she worked once a week or twice a week at the local smoothie stand. That was my favorite place to go and get a smoothie or an acai every day when I was done surfing, when I was living on the North Shore in Kauai. And one day we started talking and we started saying, oh, we should go out surfing together. This is where I surf, yada, yada, yada. And I found out that Amanda's best friend from Eastern Canada had just graduated with a super specific and helpful technical degree that I needed help with. So I hired your best friend, Hannah, and Hannah has been, shout out Hannah Green from Fredericton, New Brunswick, is single-handedly, yesterday I literally printed out 50 maps that Hannah made, and I took them with another 20 or 30 maps that she made a couple weeks ago. And all day today before the show, I've been traveling around and I've been talking with a lot of different people in the community about the maps that Hannah made for me so that we can be here and we can be looking specifically at, we are working to create potential control lines in areas of high severity so that wildfire fighters have easier and safer access and better opportunities to control devastating wildfire when it comes to this community. And that work is happening because of Amanda. So I just want to give you a big thank you and let you know that it's really making a big difference for folks here in Curry County.
Absolutely. I will never forget you swinging in the hammock while we were in Kalalau, and we had backpacks, and we came there with Dakotah pulls out 4 large carrots, 6 sweet potatoes, and his jet boil, and his water bag, which saved us, and Hannah's maps. Studying Hannah's maps, first maps he ever made him. In his hammock when we're in one of the most beautiful places on earth. And yeah, shout out Hannah. You've captivated this man since the beginning.
All right, Amanda, that is the end of our show. But thank you so much for being our guest today. This has been great to catch up with you. It's been too long. And yeah, it's been a real treat. So thank you from KCIW.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'll talk to you later, Skater. And thanks everybody at KCIW, greatest volunteer radio of all time. And you can meet us here at the same time next week.